Leipzig, Germany, November 1923. Two neighbors. One is a concert pianist, 15 years of training, performed at the Gewandhaus, recordings sold across Europe. The other is a plumber who learned his trade at 16 from an uncle who never finished school. Today, the pianist is begging for bread. The plumber is eating 3 meals. Most people think that's a story about blue-collar versus white-collar work. It isn't. The conventional belief goes like this. Get educated, get credentialed, climb high enough, and economic storms won't touch you. The higher your degree, the safer your floor. Here's what 7 decades of economic autopsies actually show. Every single collapse in recorded history has inverted that hierarchy. Doctors driving taxis, engineers washing cars, PhDs trading cigarettes for potatoes. But here's the part nobody tells you. Buried deep in labor market forensics from Weimar Germany to Venezuela, the skills that actually survived aren't the ones you'd expect. And one of them isn't even a trade. Part 1. The repair economy. Where collapse creates demand. Picture a mechanic's garage in Buenos Aires, December 2001. Argentina has just defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt, the largest default in history at the time. Banks are frozen. Cash machines are empty. The peso is about to be unpegged from the dollar and lose 60% of its value overnight. Middle-class families are banging pots in the streets. The mechanic doesn't stop working. His name isn't important. What's important is what happened to his income. Before the crisis, he charged 50 pesos per hour. After the devaluation, he charged 50 pesos per hour. The nominal number was the same, but in dollar terms, his services had become dramatically cheaper, and demand exploded. Argentines who had been trading in their cars for new models every 3 years suddenly needed those same cars to last another decade. The mechanic who could make a 1995 Renault run another 100,000 kilometers was no longer a commodity. He was essential infrastructure. This is the first law of collapse economics, and it is ironclad. When people can no longer afford to replace things, the person who can repair them becomes a critical node in the survival economy. The data from NBER, working papers on the 2001 to 2002 Argentine crisis, confirms the pattern. Formal employment in finance, retail, and professional services collapsed. Skilled trades, mechanics, electricians, plumbers, metalworkers, saw employment hold, and in many cases, real wages in the informal economy actually increased because supply contracted faster than demand. The Argentine automotive repair sector processed an estimated 30% more vehicles in 2002 than in 2000, despite the economic carnage. The same forensic signature appears in every collapse. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923. As the mark fell from 75 per US dollar to 4.2 trillion per dollar, institutional employment, clerks, accountants, bureaucrats, became economically worthless faster than the currency itself. But the skilled tradespeople who maintained the physical infrastructure of daily life operated in a parallel barter economy that the hyperinflation couldn't fully reach. A plumber in Berlin in 1923 wasn't paid in marks. He was paid in coal, bread, sausage, firewood. His skills bypassed the dying monetary system entirely and plugged directly into the real economy of survival goods. Cuba's special period, 1993. The Soviet Union had collapsed 2 years earlier. Cuba lost 80% of its oil imports and 85% of its trade overnight. GDP contracted 34%. The formal economy froze, but mechanics and repair workers operating in the informal economy found themselves in extraordinary demand because the government couldn't import new equipment and the old Soviet machinery needed to keep running. A Cuban mechanic who could fabricate replacement parts from scrap metal became more valuable to the state than a university-trained economist. Here's why this matters to the larger picture. Repair skills are anti-fragile. Most skills lose value during economic contraction. They are correlated with prosperity, but repair skills invert. The worse things get, the more broken things accumulate, and the more desperately people need someone who can fix them. You are not riding the economic cycle. You are counter-cycling it. In financial terms, repair skill is a long position on economic dysfunction, and dysfunction is always available. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data through 2024 shows this isn't just historical. HVAC mechanics and installers are projected to grow at 8% through 2034, roughly 80,000 openings per year. Electricians at 9%, around 81,000 annually. Solar photovoltaic installers at 48% over the next decade. These aren't growth industries in the conventional sense. They are resilience industries. They thrive because the infrastructure they maintain cannot be outsourced, automated away in the field, or replaced by a cheaper digital alternative. The pipe is either fixed or it isn't. Part 2. The most dangerous skill in history, monetary translation. Here's the one they never put in the economics textbooks. Buenos Aires, October 2011. On the corner of Florida Street and Laval, men stand on the sidewalk whispering one word to passing pedestrians. Cambio. Exchange. They are called arbolitos, Little trees, because they stand still and wait, like trees for customers to come to them. They are the informal dollar traders of Argentina, operating in defiance of government currency controls. They buy U.S. dollars at the black market rate and sell at a premium. The spread between the official rate and the black market rate, called the blue dollar, sometimes exceeded 60%. These men weren't educated. Many had no formal qualifications. What they had was something far more dangerous: the ability to read price differentials between two parallel monetary systems in real time and arbitrage the gap. They were practicing the oldest and most lethal financial skill in human history. Every economic collapse creates a dual monetary reality: the official system, dying, state-enforced, visible, and the real system, informal, adaptive, parallel. The gap between them is where fortunes are made and lost. And the person who can fluently operate in both, who understands the exchange rate between the collapsing currency and whatever real store of value has replaced it, holds a form of power that no hyperinflation can destroy. This is what I call the monetary translation skill, and the historical forensics on it are staggering. Weimar Germany produced its most famous beneficiaries, and they were not, as popular history often implies, foreigners buying German assets cheaply. The earliest and most consistent winners were German currency brokers operating in the gray market. Individuals who understood the exchange mechanics between the mark and the foreign currencies that were replacing it as real stores of value. These brokers facilitated transactions between ordinary Germans desperate to convert their disintegrating savings and the emerging parallel currency economy. The Reichsbank couldn't stop them because stopping them would have meant stopping commerce entirely. Lebanon, 2019 to 2023. The Lebanese pound collapsed from 1,500 to the dollar to 89,000 to the dollar. The entire banking system froze. An entire middle class was financially annihilated. But throughout that collapse, sarraf operators, informal currency exchange brokers deeply embedded in Lebanese commercial culture, continued functioning. They were the capillaries of the economy when the arteries had hardened. People who understood how to facilitate exchange between the dying pound and the dollar economy didn't just survive. They became indispensable. Zimbabwe, 2007 to 2009. The official currency was imploding so fast that the government was printing $100 trillion notes. But the informal economy didn't stop. It reorganized around the U.S. dollar, South African rand, and commodity barter. The people who acted as translation nodes between these parallel systems, who could price a transaction in multiple simultaneous currencies, who understood what a bond note was worth versus a greenback, were the lubricant that kept commerce from seizing entirely. Venezuela, 2016 to present. The Bolivar's collapse created an entire informal economy of forex operators, individuals who could facilitate transactions between the official Bolivar rate, the black market dollar rate, and the USDT stablecoin transactions that became increasingly common as the crisis deepened. According to World Bank data on Venezuelan economic informalization, by 2021, approximately 65% of all transactions in Venezuela were being conducted in foreign currency, primarily dollars. The informal operators who enabled this shift were not speculators. They were the people who kept the economy breathing. Here is the deeper mechanism. When a currency collapses, what is actually happening is that the official price signal, the system through which an economy communicates value, is being destroyed. Prices expressed in the dying currency become noise, not signal. But humans still need to coordinate economic activity. They still need to buy food and pay rent and compensate labor. What they desperately need is someone who can translate between the dying signal and the emerging one. That translation function, understanding price across monetary regimes, is the most valuable skill in the collapse economy. This is why Ray Dalio, in his study of the changing world order, identifies what he calls the last stage of reserve currency decline, not as a moment of sudden rupture, but as a period of accelerating monetary fragmentation. In every historical case, he examined the Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling, the pre-war German mark. There was an intermediate period in which multiple currencies competed for dominance within the same economy. The people who could read and operate across that fragmentation captured disproportionate value. The skill isn't illegal. The knowledge isn't secret. What makes it rare is that almost nobody studies it before they need it. If you can understand how prices are being set in a parallel monetary system, if you can read the real exchange rate between whatever is dying and whatever is replacing it, and if you can facilitate that exchange for others, you're not just surviving a collapse. You are providing the most critical infrastructure that any collapsing economy possesses. Part 3. The knowledge that cannot be inflated away. Moscow suburbs, summer 1992. The Soviet Union has been dead for 8 months. Shop shelves are empty. Inflation is running at 2,600% annually. Pensions are vaporizing. And yet, 71% of Russian households have a dacha, a small plot of land, usually outside the city, and they know how to use it. By 1992, dachas were producing 92% of Russia's potato crop, 77% of its vegetables, 87% of its berries and fruit, 59% of its meat, 49% of its milk. Households representing perhaps 3% of arable land were producing more than half of the country's food supply, on plots averaging between 600 and 1,500 square meters. Russia did not experience a famine after the Soviet collapse. The reason is almost entirely attributable to the preservation of household food production knowledge across generations of Soviet citizens. The knowledge of how to plant, harvest, preserve, and store food, knowledge that the state had never managed to fully extinguish despite decades of collectivized agriculture, constituted the most important national food security asset in Russian history. You cannot confiscate agricultural knowledge. You cannot inflate away the ability to grow potatoes. You cannot freeze a bank account that holds fermentation skills. But here's the distinction that history makes clear, and it's one that most people miss entirely. It wasn't the ownership of land that protected Russian families in 1992. It was the knowledge of food production and preservation. Academic economists and urban professionals who acquired dachas as status symbols in the 1980s but had never learned to actually farm were no better protected than their urban neighbors. The soil was there. The seeds were available. But the knowledge of when to plant, how to manage pests without chemical inputs that had disappeared from shelves, how to can vegetables without botulism, how to cold store root vegetables through a Russian winter, that was the survival variable. This same forensic signature appears in Argentina, 2001 to 2002. When the formal economy imploded, a remarkable economic phenomenon emerged, the truc, a national barter network that at its peak involved 6 million Argentines trading goods and services using locally printed credits. Participants who brought production skills, food preservation, sewing and repair, herbal medicine, childcare, extracted more value from the truc networks than those who brought credentials. A woman who could teach others to make and preserve food commanded exchange value in the truc that no professional credential could match. The knowledge was the currency. The NBER working papers on food security during economic crises consistently show that households with active food production knowledge, not just ownership of land, but actual practice skill, demonstrate substantially higher economic resilience across multiple collapse scenarios. They are less exposed to food price inflation, less dependent on currency stability for caloric intake, and better positioned to participate in barter economies when formal markets contract. This is more relevant than it has ever been. As of 2024, the global food system is running on extraordinary complexity. 75% of global food calories come from only 12 plants and 5 animals. The supply chains that deliver those calories to urban populations pass through dozens of countries, hundreds of companies, thousands of logistics nodes. The 2020 to 2021 supply chain disruptions showed how quickly those chains can break. The knowledge of how to produce, preserve, and distribute food locally, knowledge that was universal 2 generations ago and is now vanishingly rare, is quietly becoming the most undervalued form of human capital on Earth. Part 4. The skill that scales when institutions collapse. Havana, Cuba, 1993. You are a physician with 7 years of medical training. You have the highest credential in the most universally valued field. People will always need medicine, and yet the special period has exposed something brutal about the relationship between credentials and value. Your hospital has no anesthetics, no antibiotics, often no electricity. The institutional system that transforms your credential into healing, the supply chains, the pharmaceutical infrastructure, the bureaucratic machinery, has collapsed. And simultaneously, the Cuban government has classified physicians among the occupations explicitly prohibited from self-employment. Your credential is now not just economically worthless. It is a legal barrier, preventing you from earning survival income. 10,000 Cuban doctors made the same calculation. They drove taxis. This is the central paradox of credential-based skills during collapse, and it's one that the reference data from Weimar to Venezuela confirms with uncomfortable consistency. The more institutional infrastructure a skill requires to generate value, the more vulnerable it is to systemic failure. A medical degree requires a functioning hospital. A law degree requires functioning courts. An accounting credential requires functioning businesses with books to balance. When the institutions fail, the credential-dependent professional discovers they are not holding a skill. They are holding a dependency. But within this general pattern, the forensics show a critical exception. Medical knowledge, not the credential, not the institutional practice of medicine, but the underlying knowledge of human biology, disease, wound care, and pharmacology, demonstrates extraordinary survival value precisely because it addresses the most fundamental human need of all, staying alive. The Cuban physicians who survived the special period with their economic dignity intact were those who had internalized medical knowledge deeply enough to practice it informally outside the hospital with whatever materials were available. Community-based healthcare in Cuba during the 1990s increasingly depended on physicians who could diagnose and treat without imaging equipment, without pharmaceutical supply chains, using natural and improvised alternatives. The World Health Organization documented in the late 1990s that Cuba maintained surprising health outcomes during this special period, not because institutions held, but because practitioners adapted their knowledge to institutional absence. The same pattern appeared in post-Soviet Russia, in post-collapse Venezuela, and in wartime and post-conflict environments studied by the World Bank. The common thread is not just medical knowledge, but something broader: the ability to apply knowledge of human physiology and basic biology without institutional mediation. People who could set bones, suture wounds, manage infections with basic antiseptics, recognize and treat nutritional deficiencies, and provide prenatal care without hospital access constituted one of the most universally valued skill sets in every collapse environment examined. This points toward a broader principle that ties all four skills together. The skills that survived every economic collapse in history share one structural property. They function independent of institutional systems. The repair trade needs no bureaucracy. The monetary translator needs no clearinghouse. The food producer needs no supply chain. The barefoot medic needs no hospital. Each skill addresses a fundamental human need directly, without institutional intermediation. And in a collapse, it is precisely the institutional intermediation that fails first. The framework: why your credentials are institutionally dependent. Tim Harford, in ADAPT, makes an observation about economic evolution that applies with brutal precision here. He notes that the systems most likely to survive shocks are not the most sophisticated, but the most modular, the ones that can decouple from each other and continue functioning independently when the larger system fails. Your credential is the opposite of modular. It is entirely dependent on the system that conferred it. Harvard cannot give you an MBA that functions when Harvard's institutional context doesn't exist. The Bar Association cannot give you a law license that means anything when courts are closed. These credentials are derivatives. Their value is derived entirely from the underlying institutional system. A skill that addresses a fundamental human need is not a derivative. It is the underlying asset. This is why the Bureau of Labor Statistics data on recession employment shows such consistent patterns. Across the 2001 recession, the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, and the 2020 COVID shock, skilled trades maintained employment at rates dramatically higher than knowledge economy occupations. Not because trades are inherently more valuable in normal times, they often aren't, but because the institutional infrastructure they depend on is thinner and more resilient. A plumber doesn't need a functioning securities market to fix a pipe. A financial analyst does. And here is where the contemporary picture becomes genuinely unsettling. Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, has publicly stated that AI could eliminate between 40 and 60% of entry-level white-collar positions within 5 years. J.P. Morgan's research into AI-driven labor market disruption focuses explicitly on a routine cognitive task, occupations, the same category of occupations that proved most vulnerable during historical collapses. The credential-dependent knowledge worker faces a simultaneous threat from two directions: technological displacement in stable conditions and institutional dependency during systemic failure. The most resilient portfolio of human capital is not the one that maximizes income in stable times. It is the one that retains exchange value across the widest range of systemic conditions. Here is what history has actually been trying to tell you. Every collapse you've studied, from the Roman debasement of the denarius to Weimar wheelbarrows to the Lebanese banking freeze, follows the same sequence. Institutions fail, credentials evaporate, and the people who retain economic dignity are the ones whose skills address fundamental human needs without requiring the failed system to function. The repair trade is not the backup plan. For most of human history, it was the primary plan. The monetary translation skill is not speculation. It is the economic infrastructure of every transition period between monetary regimes. Food production knowledge is not survivalism. It is the most reliable form of food security ever demonstrated in economic history. Medical knowledge that functions without hospitals is not alternative medicine. It is medicine, practiced by the vast majority of humanity for the vast majority of human history. You came into this video thinking about which skills are recession-proof. The real question is which skills are institution-proof. The answer has been the same for 2,000 years, across every continent, in every language, in every monetary regime. It has been demonstrated by Russian dacha farmers, Argentine mechanics, Cuban physicians, Weimar carpenters, Lebanese currency brokers, and Venezuelan Uber drivers with engineering degrees who figured it out the hard way. The skills that survive every economic collapse are the skills that never needed the institutions to begin with. History didn't teach this in school, but it's been teaching it everywhere else. If this cracked something open for you, subscribe. We perform economic autopsies here, so you don't become the next case study.